The cold in a graveyard at night has a texture you can feel through your boots. And that night, it was coming up through the soil like the ground itself was breathing. Not a draft, not wind. A slow, patient cold that rose out of the earth instead of falling out of the sky. The way cold moves in places where something has been buried wrong. I had a handheld radio pressed to my ear. The rubber of the earpiece gone tacky with 2 days of sweat. And the signal that brought us here was still pulsing through it, 3 short tones, sharp as struck glass, then a pause. Then a woman's voice reading numbers in the flat. Even cadence of someone who has done it 1,000 times. The thing is, that voice had been dead for 2 days. We'd buried the woman who recorded it on Tuesday. I dug the hole myself, in the second row near the broken angel statue with its missing wing. The spade ringing on root and stone until my palms blistered. And I knew her grave was 40 feet from where I was standing because I could see the wooden marker leaning crooked in the dark. So when her voice came through the radio, clean and steady, counting 4, 4, 9, 1, hold. I didn't tell the others right away. I told myself it was a recording, a loop, something automatic, the kind of thing a machine does without knowing it's doing it. But automatic systems don't pause to clear their throat. They don't take a breath halfway through a count the way a tired person does. And they don't say your name. Halfway through the sequence, between the 7 and the 2, the voice said, "Marcus, you shouldn't have brought them here." Flat, calm. The exact same cadence as the numbers, like my name was just another digit in the count. That was my name. Nobody at the relay knew her well enough to fake that, because nobody at the relay had known her at all until she stumbled in bleeding 9 days ago and died with a radio frequency on her lips and her hand around my wrist. I want to take a second before this goes any further to say thank you to the people who keep showing up for these stories. And welcome if this is your first time sitting with me in the dark. If grounded survival horror is the kind of thing you came for, subscribe and leave a comment, so I know you're out there. It genuinely keeps this channel alive. Now let me get back to the graveyard, because the worst part wasn't the voice. The worst part was the meter. The little signal strength bar on the side of that handheld. The one piece of the whole situation that couldn't lie to me, that didn't care what I believed or feared. It was climbing. With every step we took deeper into the cemetery, that bar crept higher. And dead transmitters do not grow louder when you walk toward an empty grave. Something down here was pushing real power into a real antenna, and it was using a dead woman to do it. My name is Marcus Vance, and before the world came apart, I was a tower climber and line technician for a regional utility cooperative. 46 years old, divorced 11 years, the kind of man who knew more about coaxial cable and grounding rods and load calculations than about people, and who'd built a whole quiet life out of that arrangement without ever quite admitting it was a hiding place. That knowledge is the only reason I'm still breathing. When the outbreak burned through our county in the first 3 weeks, the men who survived weren't the strong ones or the brave ones. The strong ones got cornered, and the brave ones got bitten doing something the rest of us were smart enough not to do. The ones who lived were the ones who understood systems, who knew which substations still had backup power humming in the dark, which water towers gravity-fed without pumps, which radio repeaters would keep broadcasting on solar trickle long after the people who built them were gone. I understood those things the way other men understand their own hands. So I lived, and I felt almost guilty about how it had nothing to do with courage. We'd set up at a place we started calling the Relay, which is what it was, an old emergency communications building on a ridge outside town. A squat concrete structure built in the 70s, 2 rooms and a tower, designed to bounce radio traffic between the county and the state during disasters, civil defense money, the kind of overbuilt federal concrete that outlasts everything around it. It had walls thick enough to stop weather and most bullets, a diesel generator in a lean-to off the back, a sealed equipment room that held its temperature even in a heat wave, and a wide flat roof with a low parapet where you could lie on your belly and see anything coming for half a mile in every direction. The fire road came up the south face. The tree line was 100 yards off to the east. Open ground all around. I'd picked it the way I'd pick a place to climb in weather, for sight lines, for escape routes, for the things that would kill you that you couldn't see. There were 11 of us living there by that 9th night. 11 people who had figured out, each in our own bloody way, that staying still and staying quiet was how you stayed alive. Because the infected hunted by sound, and they never, ever stopped moving once they locked onto something. We slept in shifts. We cooked at midday so the smell would dissipate before dark. We'd taken the squeak out of every hinge with motor oil and the rattle out of every loose panel with strips of inner tube. The relay was a place that had learned to hold its breath, and so had we. I should explain about the infected, because they aren't what you've been told. And the difference is the kind of thing that keeps you alive or kills you in the first week. They don't groan. They don't shamble. There's no slow, dragging menace you can hear coming and outwalk. They go silent, and they go fast. Faster than a man should be able to move. And the only sound they make is breathing a wet, rapid panting, high in the chest, like a dog that's run itself half to death and can't stop. In the early days, we called them runners, and then we stopped giving them names at all. Because naming a thing makes you picture it. And picturing them in the dark at 3 a.m. during your watch was how people came apart. The infection moved through saliva and blood, never airborne in the open. And it took anywhere from 6 hours to 2 full days to turn a person, depending on the bite, how deep, how close to the blood, how much of it got in. There was no fever to warn you, no sweats, no delirium, no dramatic last words. People just got quiet. They'd go still and inward for an hour or two, like they were listening to something only they could hear. And then they'd go fast, and whoever was nearest paid for not noticing. The woman we buried was named Dana. She'd come up the ridge road on the 7th night, in the last gray of dusk, holding her side with both hands and moving slow enough that Eli, who had the roof watch, called down that she wasn't turned, because the turned ones don't move slow, and they don't hold their own wounds. We almost didn't let her in anyway. The rule at the relay, the rule I'd written myself and made everyone agree to with their hand flat on the table like an oath, was that nobody came inside if they had an open wound. No exceptions. Because you cannot tell a clean cut from a bite once it scabs and swells and goes angry at the edges. And a single wrong guess in a sealed building full of sleeping people kills everyone. But Dana wasn't bitten. She'd been shot a small caliber round, in and not out, lodged low in the side. There's a difference in how a body holds a bullet wound versus a bite, in the way the skin pulls and the bruise spreads. And I'd seen enough of both by then to read it across 10 feet of bad light. So we brought her into the equipment room, laid her on a folding cot under the orange glow of the standby panel, and Priya, who'd been a veterinary tech before all this, packed the wound with what we had and kept her alive for almost 2 days. In those 2 days, Dana talked. Not much, because every word cost her a wince and a long pause to gather the next one. But enough. And I sat with her through most of it because something about the way she watched the door told me she had things she needed to hand to someone before she went. She told us she'd come from a place she called the Annex, somewhere northeast, past the old county cemetery at the bottom of the ridge. She said there was a group there, power that held, food, walls that held. She said they'd sent her out to find more people, more hands, more skills, and that the way back was marked by a signal, a transmission on a specific frequency that would guide the right kind of survivor in. She made me write the frequency down on the back of a load sheet, and then she made me read it back to her. And when I got a digit soft, she shook her head and made me say it again until I had it exactly. That should have told me something. The precision of it. The way a dying woman spent some of her last strength making sure one number was perfect. And then, near the end, when her breathing had gone shallow and her hand had found my wrist and stayed there, she said the thing that didn't make sense until it was far too late to matter. She said, "Don't follow it at night. Whatever you do, Marcus, they only run the count at night, and the count isn't for finding people. The count is for the other thing." I leaned in close. I asked her what the other thing was. She looked at me with that specific, terrible clarity dying people sometimes find right at the end. The clarity that makes a man believe every word out of a fading mouth. And she said, "You'll know it when it answers back." Her grip tightened once, hard, and then it didn't. A few hours later, just before dawn, she stopped breathing, and the room got very quiet. And Priya pulled the blanket up over her face with hands that didn't shake because Priya had done it before. We carried her down to the county cemetery at the bottom of the ridge because the ground at the relay was solid bedrock under 2 inches of dirt, and we had nothing that would dig it. The cemetery was a 40-minute walk down the fire road and then across a fallow field gone to thistle and brown grass close enough to matter. Far enough that we'd only ever go in daylight, and only when we had to. The cemetery itself was old, the kind that had stopped taking new residents decades before the world ended, full of leaning headstones furred with lichen and an iron perimeter fence eaten through with rust. There was a small stone chapel near the entrance, deconsecrated and locked, and a caretaker's shed that had folded in on itself years ago under the weight of a fallen limb. We'd scouted it once for supplies in the second week and found nothing worth the carry: a few rusted tools, some rotted hymnals, a wasp nest the size of a basketball. After that, we mostly forgot the place existed. I buried Dana near the broken angel because it was the only landmark I could pick out in the failing light. And because some stubborn old part of me wanted her to have something with its face turned toward her, even a stone one with a missing wing. Eli hammered together a marker from 2 slats of pallet wood. We said nothing over the grave because words cost noise, and we walked back up the ridge in the dark with our hands tight on our weapons. That was Tuesday. Thursday night, I heard her voice come back. It started the way these things always start, as nothing. I ran a band scan every night around 11, sitting alone in the equipment room with a handheld and a pair of headphones, sweeping the local frequencies for any sign of organized survivors, a relay net, a militia channel, anything human and alive and reachable. Mostly there was nothing. Dead air, the hiss of an empty world. That night, I almost dialed past Dana's frequency without thinking, because I'd half forgotten I'd even written it into the scan list. Then came the carrier hum. That particular dead air sound a transmitter makes when it keys up with nothing yet to say. A clean, steady tone that meant real equipment with real power behind it, not the ragged noise of a failing battery rig. I stopped the scan. Then the 3 tones, sharp and even and machine perfect. Then the voice. A woman, reading numbers in that flat, practiced cadence. 4, 4, 9, 1, hold. The numbers meant nothing to me on their own, but the cadence meant everything, because I knew that cadence. That's how spy stations and emergency networks have transmitted coordinates and instructions for a century, in groups, with deliberate pauses for the listener to write each one down before the next arrives. It was a structured transmission, disciplined, built by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. I sat there in the dark with the radio against my ear for a long time, longer than I should have, listening to a voice I was almost certain belonged to a woman I had put in the ground 48 hours before. And I did what a technician does when he can't trust his own ears. I refused to conclude anything. Voices are hard to place through a 2-inch speaker. Dana had only spoken to me for 2 days, in a dying whisper, never at full strength. I might be wrong. So I decided I would gather data before I let myself believe the thing that the cold in my chest already believed. I told 3 people, because 3 was enough to verify and few enough to control. Priya, who had nursed Dana for 2 days and might know the voice. Eli, 22, fast and level-headed, and the only one of us who could put a round where he wanted it under pressure. And Ruth, 61, who had run a county emergency dispatch center for 30 years before retirement and knew more about how emergency communications actually functioned than anyone alive within 100 miles. I played the recording for them on the 4th night, when the signal came back at the same time, almost to the minute at 11:17, which itself told me something, because random noise doesn't keep a schedule. The numbers were different. 6, 6, 2, 8, hold. The voice was the same. Priya went white. She had her arms wrapped around herself the way she did when she was cold or scared. And she didn't say anything for almost a full minute, just listened with her jaws set. Then she said very quietly, "That's her. That's Dana." I'd know that voice anywhere now. When the pain got bad, she used to count her own pulse out loud to ride it out. 4, 4. That's exactly how she said it. That little catch on the second number. She swallowed. "That's her, Marcus." Ruth listened the way Ruth listened to everything, with her head tilted a few degrees and her eyes half closed, the posture of a woman who'd spent 3 decades hearing the difference between a real emergency and a crank call through a hiss of static. When the burst ended, she opened her eyes and said the thing that should have ended it right there. "Marcus, a relay broadcasting on a fixed schedule with a human voice reading number groups that is not a beacon for finding survivors. A survivor beacon is a simple repeating call sign, plain language, come this way. This is a directed transmission. Somebody recorded those groups to mean something to somebody specific. And whoever recorded that voice did it after Dana came to us, because the woman said your name in the first recording. She didn't know your name before she got here. That was the detail that took the floor out from under me. The recording had said my name. Marcus, you shouldn't have brought them here. Dana had learned my name in this building, in that equipment room, in those 2 dying days. Which meant the recording, if it was a recording, had been made here, or made by something that knew what had happened here after she arrived among us. And we had no transmitter at the relay with the power to reach the annex. The tower was a passive repeater with no working uplink. And nobody had left the ridge since the burial except to come straight back. Somebody had recorded her, or something was wearing her voice. And it was broadcasting from the direction of the hole I'd dug for her. Ruth wanted to leave it alone, and she said so plainly, in the way old dispatchers say things, with all the drama filed off. A signal that knows your name and tells you not to come is a signal you do not answer, Marcus. You don't walk toward a thing that's already warning you off. That's bait, or it's a trap, or it's something there's no word for. And there is no version of this that ends with us better off than we are right now. She was right. I knew she was right the way, you know, a storm is coming before the first drop hits. I would give almost anything now to have stood up and turned the radio off and let it be. But there was a pressure under all of us that night. sitting heavy in the room like that cold coming up out of the cemetery soil. And it was the one thing I hadn't said out loud yet. We were running out of diesel. The generator that ran our lights and charged the radios and pulled water up from the well had maybe 9 days of fuel left at the rate we burned it, and less if the weather turned and we had to run heat. We'd siphoned and scavenged every drop within walking distance, drained farm tanks, pulled fuel from dead cars, bled a road grader dry on the county line. The relay was a good place to survive a week. It was a slow grave for a winter. And Dana, before she died, had described a place with power that held and walls that held, and food enough that they could afford to send people out searching for more. The annex was real, or it had been real enough to send a woman across miles of open country to bleed out on my floor, and the only thread connecting us to it was the signal. If I dismissed the signal as a trap, I was also cutting the only line we had to the one place that might keep 11 people breathing past the first snow. So I made the decision that started all of it. We would go to the cemetery in daylight, follow the signal to its source, see with our own eyes what was broadcasting, and turn back before dark. Dana's warning had been specific, and I let myself lean on that specificity like a handrail. Don't follow it at night. The count is for the other thing. Fine. We'd go at noon with the sun straight overhead and no shadows to hide in, with 3 of us armed and Ruth on the radio as our anchor. And we'd be home before the light failed. A controlled risk. I'd built my entire survival on controlled risk. Measure the load. Check the grounding. Never climb in a storm. The trouble is that controlled risk only protects you when you understand the variables. And I understood almost nothing about what was waiting under that ground. We left at 11 the next morning. 4 of us. Me, Eli, Priya, and a quiet, heavy-shouldered man named Cole who'd driven long-haul freight for 20 years and had been coming apart from the inside since the world stopped needing him to drive anywhere. He'd asked to come because, in his words, sitting still was killing him faster than the runners ever would, and I understood that well enough to let him. Ruth stayed at the relay with the other 7 on the radio, with orders to check in every 15 minutes and to start everyone who could walk down the ridge toward us if we ever missed 2 checks in a row. We carried water, a compact first aid kit, 2 bolt-action rifles, a pump shotgun, and the handheld tuned to Dana's frequency so the rising and falling signal strength could serve as a crude compass. The plan was as simple as I could make it. Walk toward the strongest signal. Find the transmitter. Come home. Be in our own walls by dark. The fire road down the ridge was the same as it always was, washed out to bare rock in the steep places, choked with knee-high brown grass in the flat ones, and quiet in the way the whole world had learned to be quiet. We didn't talk. Talking carried, and we'd all trained ourselves out of it the way you train yourself out of any habit that might one day make a noise at the wrong moment. We moved through the morning the way you'd move through a house where someone dangerous was sleeping in the next room. The sky was a flat, featureless gray-white, the kind of overcast that gives no shadows and no warmth. And the air smelled of wet earth and the first edge of autumn rot, leaves going down in the tree line off to our left. The signal came through clean at the bottom of the hill, right on schedule for a midday burst, which surprised me. I'd assumed from Dana's warning that it only ran after dark, but there it was at 11:40. The 3 tones, the count, 6, 6, 2, 8, hold, the voice the same. Priya flinched at it, an involuntary tightening of her whole frame, and her hand closed harder around the radio she was carrying, knuckles paling. For me, it was a technical puzzle with a hole in the middle of it. For her, it was Dana, alive in a black plastic box, reading numbers to nobody across a dead field. The signal strength bar climbed steadily as we pushed across the field toward the cemetery. And that's the part no amount of reasoning could talk its way around. Signal strength is physics. It is the most honest thing in the world. It does not flatter you, and it does not lie, and it does not care in the slightest what you've decided to believe about ghosts. The closer we drew to the graveyard, the stronger the transmission, which meant the source was inside or beneath the cemetery itself. And there was no equipment building there. No tower, no mast, no array. Nothing but a locked stone chapel, a collapsed shed, and a few hundred graves under a flat gray sky. And somewhere in among all that, a transmitter strong enough to push a clean carrier up a quarter-mile ridge, running on power that had no business existing. We came through the iron gate a little after noon. The hinges had rusted half open years ago, and we slipped through the gap, one at a time. The cemetery looked exactly as it had the first time. The leaning stones, the dead grass standing brittle and seed-headed, the broken angel in the second row with the stump where its wing had been, weathered smooth. Dana's grave was where I'd left it. The mound of disturbed earth had already begun to settle and sink, the way fresh graves do as the soil packs down. Around what's in them, and Eli's crooked pallet wood marker still stood at the head of it. The signal meter was nearly pinned to the top of its range. Whatever was broadcasting was within 50 feet of where the four of us stood. And there was nothing there but the dead. Cole was the one who found the door. He drifted off toward the chapel while the rest of us stood near Dana's grave, staring down at a radio that insisted, against all evidence, that we were standing on top of a working transmitter. He called back to us, low and careful, pitching his voice the way we'd all learned to. "Marcus, the lock's been cut." I came over. He was right. The chapel had been chained and padlocked when we scouted it weeks ago. I remembered the lock specifically. A heavy new brass padlock, conspicuously out of place on a building that had been abandoned since before any of us were born. I'd noted it the way I noted everything that didn't fit. Now the chain hung loose against the doorframe, and the padlock lay in the dead grass at the threshold, and somebody had cut it. Bolt cutters. The cut was clean and bright, the exposed metal still shining silver, no rust, no weathering. Recent. Days, not weeks. We hadn't cut it. Nobody from the relay had set foot down here since the burial. And the runners didn't carry tools, didn't cut locks, didn't open doors and leave. Somebody human had opened this chapel within the last day or two, and they'd done it deliberately. And they'd gone. I felt the back of my neck go tight in a way it hadn't since the early weeks. I should have turned everyone around right then. Every rule I'd written for the relay said the same thing. You do not enter a confined space that somebody else has recently opened, because confined spaces are where you die, and recently opened means recently occupied, by someone or something whose intentions you don't know. But the signal was coming from inside. The meter said so, flatly, without sympathy. And inside that chapel was the only answer to the only question that mattered. Whether the place that might keep my people alive through winter was real, or whether something I had no name for was using a dead woman's voice to draw us underground. So I made the second decision, the one that mattered more than the first. I told Eli to hold the gate and watch the field behind us. I told Cole to cover the approach, and I went into the chapel with Priya at my shoulder and the shotgun up in my hands. The inside was dark and close and wrong from the first breath. I'd braced for the smell of a building shut up for decades. Dust, dry rot, mouse droppings, the sweet stink of damp stone. It didn't smell like that at all. It smelled like a working space. Ozone, faint and electric, warm electronics, That particular dry heat that comes off equipment that's been running a long time. Machine oil. The pews had been dragged from their bolts and shoved back against the walls to clear the floor. And in the center of that cleared floor, where an altar would have stood, was a steel hatch set flush into the concrete. Not the chapel's original floor. Someone had broken through the old stone years ago and poured a concrete pad and set this hatch into it. The kind of hatch you'd find on a fallout shelter or a hardened civil defense installation, ring-handled, heavy, rated to hold against pressure. It was open. A steel ladder dropped down into the dark below it. And from down that hole, faint and steady, I could hear the 3 tones and the count. But now closer, with the chapel's stone walls cutting out the world's noise, I could hear something underneath it that the radio's little speaker had filtered away. Under Dana's voice, running constant in the background, was the sound of breathing. The wet, rapid panting I'd spent 9 days learning to fear in my bones. A great deal of it. Far more than 4 people could make. Rising up out of the hole that the signal was calling from, layered over itself. Dozens of chests working at once. I stood at the lip of that ladder with a shotgun and tried to make the pieces fit. And they fit. And I hated the shape they made. There was a shelter under the cemetery. It had power that explained the transmitter, the warm electronics smell. All of it. The chapel had been opened recently, with tools by someone human. The signal used Dana's voice and somehow knew my name. And the shelter was full of the infected. Dana's last words came back with a new and unbearable meaning. The count isn't for finding people. The count is for the other thing. You'll know it when it answers back. The count had never been a beacon to bring survivors home. It was a lure or a leash. And the breathing coming up that ladder was the thing it had been built to hold. Priya was at my shoulder, and she'd heard it too. She'd gone completely still in the way that prey animals go, still when the shadow of the hawk crosses the grass, not frozen in panic, but frozen in calculation. Every muscle waiting for the one piece of information that would tell it which way to run. I started backing toward the chapel door, slow and quiet, easing my weight off each foot the way I'd ease off a bad foothold on a tower, the way you retreat from a thing that hasn't yet noticed you. And that's when the count stopped, mid-sequence. Dana's voice, down in the dark, cut off clean between 2 numbers, in a place where the recording should have kept going. And the breathing stopped too. All of it, at once. The way a crowded room goes silent when a door opens behind you. The absence of that sound was somehow worse than the sound itself had been. A vacuum that pressed in on my ears. And into that absolute quiet, a different voice came up the ladder. Not Dana's, a man's, calm, close, unhurried, like he was standing just below the lip of the hatch with his head tilted up toward the daylight. "You're early," he said. "We don't usually get the live ones until dark." A pause. "Don't run. Running is the worst thing you can do down here, and it's the worst thing you can do up there too. Come down, and I'll explain. Or go back up and try to explain it to your friends after they've already decided you're infected for coming out of the death hole with blood on you. Your choice. But choose now, because the count stopped, and they noticed, and they are going to start moving." And the breathing started again, faster than before. I have replayed the next 10 seconds more times than I can count. Lying awake on my back on the equipment room cot, listening to that signal still coming through the wall. And I still don't know if I read it right. A voice I'd never heard. Rising up out of a pit full of the infected, offering me answers in a reasonable tone. My back to a door, my friend beside me, a dead woman's voice still ringing in my skull. down toward the thing that knew too much, or up toward the people I trusted who might put a round in me for what I was standing over. Tell me what you would have done. I'd honestly like to know where you'd have put your feet, because I've never once been sure I put mine right. I went down. Not because I trusted the voice, I trusted nothing about it. I went down because the breathing was getting faster and closer. And the one thing I knew for certain was that if those things came up the ladder into the chapel, they'd be loose in the open cemetery between us and the relay. And Eli and Cole would be standing in the field with rifles and no idea what was bearing down on them. Going down meant I might be able to close the hatch behind me and seal the fault before it spread into the world. A technician's instinct, the oldest one I had. When a system fails, you isolate it. You don't run from the fault. You go to it and you cut it off from everything you're trying to protect. I told Priya to go back up, to get the others and run for the relay and not wait on me. She didn't move fast enough, and there was no time to argue it. So I swung onto the ladder first with the shotgun slung across my back and the flashlight clamped in my teeth. And she came down after me anyway, because she was a vet tech to the bone, and leaving a person behind simply wasn't in her. And I cursed her under my breath and was grateful for her in the same ragged exhale. The shaft dropped maybe 15 feet, the rungs cold and gritty under my hands, and opened into a corridor of poured concrete, lit by dim amber emergency fixtures recessed behind wire cages. The man was waiting at the bottom. Older than me, maybe 60, gaunt to the point of hollow, gray stubble over a gray face, a headlamp pushed up on his forehead and a respirator hanging loose around his neck. He had a pistol holstered on his hip, but his hands were open and held out from his body where I could see them, fingers spread. He'd done this before, stood unarmed in front of a frightened man with a gun and made himself easy to read. The corridor ran maybe 30 feet behind him to a heavy steel door, and that door was shut. And behind it was where all the breathing was coming from. I could feel it through the floor as much as hear it. He saw me clock the door, and he said, "They're contained, for now. That door holds, it's rated for blast. It'll hold against bodies all day. The hatch you came down is the only other way out of this whole level. And you left it open." I didn't close it. Priya was still on the rungs above me. The others were up top. And I was not about to seal myself 15 feet underground with a stranger and a room full of runners on the strength of a calm voice. I kept the shotgun low, but my finger near the guard. And I asked him the one question that had driven me down the ladder in the first place. Whose voice was on the radio? He told me his name was Garrett, and that before the collapse, he'd been a network engineer for the state's emergency management agency. This shelter under the cemetery, he said, was a Cold War relocation site. One of the quiet ones, built in the early 60s, mothballed, and then discreetly maintained and upgraded across the decades as a continuity of government bunker, a place for officials to ride out the worst day. It had its own deep power plant, sealed and filtered air, its own well. Food stores rated for 100 people for a year. When the outbreak swept through, a group of county and state officials and their families had come down here and sealed the hatch behind them. Garrett had been brought in for one reason: to keep the communications systems alive. Because the whole point of a continuity site is that information has to outlast everything else. And for a while, he said, it had worked exactly the way it was meant to. The bunker held. The walls held. The air stayed clean. Then someone inside got bitten. They'd let a man down through the maintenance shaft in the first week. Someone who swore up and down he was clean. And he wasn't a bite high on the back of the shoulder, scabbed over, easy to hide under a collar. By the time anyone understood what was in their air, was already loose in the dormitory, in the close, recycled atmosphere of a sealed space, with no exit that didn't lead up and through the graves. 41 people had come down into that bunker. Within 9 days, 38 of them were behind that steel door, breathing the way the things behind it were breathing now. Garrett and 2 others had survived by sealing themselves into the communications section, which had its own door and its own independent filtered air. Because the engineers who built the place, decades ago, had designed the comms room to be defensible from the rest of the facility on the cold, correct theory that information needed to be able to outlast its own people. "And the signal," I said. "Dana." He didn't so much as blink at the name, and that told me he knew exactly who she was. He said the woman I'd buried had been the last person they sent up and out. She'd volunteered for it. By the second week, the 3 survivors in the comms room had done the math and seen the bottom of it. They couldn't stay sealed forever because the filtered section had food and water for 3 people for maybe a month. No more. And one of them was already failing. They needed help from outside. They needed someone with a technical skill to either fix the main bunker's contamination, which was impossible, or to get the docile survivors out through the cemetery and resettle them somewhere defensible, which was merely almost impossible. So they'd done the only thing left. They'd started broadcasting on a frequency Dana committed to memory, and they'd sent her up through a maintenance shaft to find someone who could help. A specific kind of someone. "She found you," Garrett said, and there was something almost gentle in how tired he sounded. "Before she went up, she told us there was a man at the old county relay who climbed towers and understood power systems. She'd heard it somewhere, or seen your tower running when nothing else was. She said if anyone alive could help us, it'd be him. Then she went up to bring you back, and she never came back, and we assumed the surface had taken her like it takes everyone." He studied my face in the amber light. "She didn't make it, did she? That's why you went gray when I said her name. She got to you, and she died there." I told him. I told him she'd been shot, not bitten, that she'd come to us bleeding, and we'd kept her alive 2 days, and that she was in the ground in the cemetery directly over his head, 40 feet from where I'd come down the ladder, near a broken stone angel. And then I asked him the question that had been sitting in my chest like a stone since the chapel. I asked him how her voice was on the radio, 2 days dead, reading numbers, saying my name, telling me not to come. Garrett went quiet. For the first time, the calm cracked, just at the edges, just enough to see something underneath it. He said, "We recorded her before she went up. She read the count for us, the number groups we used to time the transmitter and keep it from drifting off frequency. It's an automated loop. It plays on a schedule off a stored file, but..." He stopped. His eyes went to the steel door, to the breathing behind it. "It's a loop, Marcus. It plays number groups. It doesn't say names. It has never said a name because there are no names in the file. I built the file. I know every byte that's on it." He looked back at me, and what was in his face now was not calm at all. "If that recording said your name, then the recording didn't do it. Something else is using the channel." That was the moment the story I thought I'd walked into came apart in my hands. I'd climbed down that ladder expecting a broken survivor running a sad little beacon, a desperate man and a dead woman's tape, playing to an empty world. Instead, I had the man who built the signal swearing on his own work that it could not possibly say what I'd heard it say. In a sealed bunker, with 38 infected breathing behind a blast door, and a transmission that knew my name, reaching up a ridge to a station no one else on Earth could have reached. If you've been with me through these stories before, you know I don't reach for the supernatural. I don't believe in it. There is always a system underneath, always a wire and a load and a reason. And I have built my whole life and my whole survival on the certainty of that. But standing in that amber corridor, I couldn't find the system. And not finding it frightened me worse than the breathing did. Stay with me here. Because the explanation, when it finally came, was so much worse than a ghost. Garrett took me into the comms room. It was the only place to talk, and I wasn't going to stand a single foot from that steel door to have a conversation. The comms room was small and warm and close, lit by the steady orange glow of equipment racks that filled one whole wall. Cooling fans whispering, indicator lights breathing slow green and amber in the dark. There were 2 narrow cots against the far wall, and on one of them lay a third person, a woman, maybe 40, either unconscious or in the gray country just short of it, her face slack and slick with a sheen of sweat, her breathing too fast and too shallow. I asked if she was sick. Garrett said she was dying, but not from the infection, an ordinary death. The kind the old world cured every day without a second thought. An appendix, or a twisted gut, or some internal failure that none of them could touch, without surgery and equipment they didn't have. That, he said, was the real reason their timeline had become a countdown. They were down to 2 people who could function, and soon they'd be down to 1. And one person cannot run a continuity site and walk 34 bodies through a graveyard and bury the dead and keep the air clean all at once. Then he showed me the thing that rewrote everything I thought I understood. On the comms bench, among the radios and the patch panels, was a small security monitor. Grainy, black and white, the picture rolling slightly at the top, the way old analog feeds do. It showed the inside of the main bunker, the dormitory section behind the steel door. The camera looked down the length of a long room lined with bunks, and the room was full of them, 30-some figures. But they weren't shambling. They weren't milling or clawing or pressing at the walls. They were standing, perfectly still, all of them facing the same direction, facing a single speaker mounted high on the end wall, from which, Garrett said, the count played on its endless loop, the same count that climbed the antenna and went out across the dead world to my ridge. And as the 2 of us stood there, watching that gray, rolling picture, the count began its next scheduled burst. And on the screen, every one of those figures turned its head toward the speaker at the same instant, in perfect, fluid unison. 30-some heads moving as one, like a single animal that happened to be wearing 38 bodies. They respond to it, Garrett said, and his voice had gone flat and careful, the same register Ruth's voice found when something was too big to feel out loud. The count. They go still for it. We worked it out by accident in the second week, when the file glitched and went silent for 90 seconds, and they all came awake at once and nearly took the door. When the signal plays, they stop. They stand and they listen, and they don't attack the door, and they don't tear at the walls. When it stops, they move. So we never let it stop. As long as that count runs, the steel door stays intact, and we stay alive. The signal was never a beacon for survivors. Not really. It's a leash. Dana's words, again, with their full weight finally on me. The count isn't for finding people. The count is for the other thing. You'll know it when it answers back. She hadn't been warning me about a trap set by clever people. She'd been warning me that the signal I would inevitably follow was the only thing in the world holding 38 infected still in their sleep. And that the closer I came to it, the more I'd need to understand it. And the more I understood it, the more certainly I'd be drawn into doing the one thing Garrett was about to ask of me. Because here was the trap folded inside the truth, the real shape of the thing. The signal kept the infected docile, but the transmitter that played the signal was dying. The main power plant was degrading, and keeping it alive meant entering the contaminated section to reach the generator room. And Garrett was never going through that section again. And I didn't blame him. Within a matter of days, 2, maybe 3, the bunker's main power would falter. And when it did, the count would stop, and 38 infected would come awake all at once in a sealed room with one blast door between them and the open cemetery. A cemetery whose only hatch I had personally left propped open with my friends standing over it in the daylight. Garrett needed someone who understood power systems. He needed someone who could either keep the transmitter breathing or get the docile survivors out and seal the bunker for good before the leash broke. He needed a tower climber, a line technician, a man who isolated faults for a living. Dana had crawled out of the ground looking for exactly that. And exactly that had just climbed down the ladder with a shotgun on his back. I asked him the question I dreaded most: how long the count would keep running on its own. He looked at the racks, at the gauges, at the dying woman on the cot, and he gave it to me straight. 2 days, maybe 3 on the main plant. But the comm section has its own independent fuel cell, separate from the main grid, and it'll outlast everything weeks, easy. So the transmitter itself will keep playing the count even after the main bunker goes completely dark, because the transmitter runs off the comms power. He let that land before he finished it. But the speaker in the dormitory, the one they're all listening to right now, that runs off the main bunker grid, not the comms grid. The moment the main plant dies, that speaker goes dead, and they can't hear the count anymore. He met my eyes. The signal will keep climbing your ridge, Marcus, loud as ever, just as strong. But it won't be reaching them, and the only thing it'll be doing from then on is whatever it's apparently already started doing. Calling you. That's where the math turned cruel, and I want to lay the choice out for you the way it was laid out for me. In that warm orange room with the racks whispering and a woman dying 10 feet away and a screen full of still figures facing a speaker, because I have never once stopped turning it over. The signal was the only thing keeping 38 infected from waking. The signal's reach into the dormitory ran on bunker power. Bunker power was dying. To save the connection, someone had to go into the contaminated section, find the generator, refuel it, and restart it, which meant going into the dark. Among the very things the failing signal had only barely been holding still. And to not save it meant letting the leash snap, which meant either sealing the bunker forever with 2 living people still inside it to die in the dark, or trying to walk those 2 living people up through a cemetery with 38 newly woken runners coming up the ladder behind them. There was no clean way through. There was only the question of who paid and how much and how soon. If you'd been standing where I was standing, the dying woman, the gray screen, the breathing in the walls, what would you have chosen? The dark with the generator, or the door with the dying? I'm a man who isolates faults, so I did the thing I always do, the thing that's kept me alive. I refused to accept a system with only failing states, and I started hunting for a third way. Both of the options I'd been handed ended in bodies, and somewhere in my wiring, I simply could not believe a problem this specific had no path through it. I made Garrett walk me through the bunker's entire electrical layout. Every panel, every conduit run, every transfer switch and breaker, while I sketched it on the back of the same load sheet that still had Dana's frequency on it. And then I did the thing that changed the shape of the whole problem. I raised Ruth on the handheld through the open hatch, relaying up and down the ladder with Priya as a human repeater on the rungs, because I'd remembered something. Ruth had run county dispatch for 30 years. And 30 years ago, her dispatch center had been the surface partner to this exact relocation site. She'd had the schematics pinned to the wall behind her console. She knew this building's bones better than Garrett did. What Ruth told me, in pieces handed up and down the ladder in the dark, redrew the map. The dormitory speaker that kept the infected docile ran off the main grid. Yes, Garrett had that right. But there was a manual transfer switch in a junction room. A room that sat inside the contaminated section, but right at its near edge, only about 20 feet past the steel door. That switch, Ruth said, could reroute the comm section's independent long-life fuel cell to feed the dormitory speaker circuit directly. If someone could reach it and throw it, the speaker would draw from the comms power instead of the dying bunker grid, the same long-lasting power that kept the transmitter alive. The leash would hold for weeks instead of days. And weeks meant time. Time to get the dying woman to anyone with hands and tools enough to save her. Time to plan a real evacuation instead of a panicked one. Time to not have to choose tonight between the dark and the door. But reaching that switch meant opening the steel blast door and walking 20 feet into the contaminated section, past the standing infected, while the count played and held them still. 20 feet in, throw the switch 20 feet back. As long as the count ran, they would stand and face the wall and listen. Garrett had walked among them once, in the second week, before he fully understood what they'd become, and they hadn't so much as turned, because the signal had them. The entire plan rested on one assumption, that the leash would hold for the 2 minutes it took to cross a room full of monsters and flip a knife switch. And the leash was already misbehaving. The recording was saying my name. The system was doing something its own builder could not explain. Trusting it for 2 minutes in the dark was precisely the kind of bet I'd spent a lifetime refusing to make. I made it anyway. I want to be honest with you about why. Because it wasn't courage, it was arithmetic, and it was guilt. The arithmetic was simple and ugly. Every other option spent lives outright, and this one, if it held, spent none. The guilt was simpler still. I had left the hatch open. I had brought my own people down a ridge to a place a dying woman had begged me, with her last clear breath, not to go. Dana had crossed that whole field with a bullet in her side, trying to find a man who could do exactly this one thing. And she died with my wrist in her hand. If I climbed back up that ladder and walked away into the daylight, the leash snapped in 3 days. The runners came up into the cemetery in the open, and everything Dana had bled for died in the dark with them. I was not going to let her have crossed that field for nothing. So I told Garrett to keep the count running, no matter what he saw or heard. Told Priya to climb up and get everyone well clear of the cemetery and back toward the relay. And I picked up the flashlight and unslung the shotgun and walked to the steel door. I'm going to tell you exactly what it was like inside that room, because I think about it every single night. And the only way I've found to carry it is to set it down somewhere another person can hear it and help me hold the weight. Garrett worked the bolts from the comm side and swung the blast door open. And the smell came first, before anything else, not the rot I'd braced for, but the thick, close animal stink of 38 bodies, sealed in a single space for weeks. Sweat gone rancid, old dried blood. And underneath it, something I have never found a word for and have stopped trying to. The dormitory stretched away in the dim amber emergency light, bunks down both walls, a long center aisle. And they were standing, just like the gray screen had shown me. Every one of them facing the speaker on the far end wall, backs and shoulders and the sides of their faces turned to me, heads tilted faintly up toward the sound, listening to a dead woman count to nothing. 4, 4, 9, 1, hold. The sound filled the whole room, swelling out of that one high speaker. and not one of those bodies moved. And I stepped through the door onto the concrete, and the breathing closed in around me, wet and fast and patient on every side. 38 chests rising and falling in the dark, and not one head turned my way. I'm going to tell you exactly how I crossed that room, because the how is the only part I'm proud of. The junction room was to my right, 20 feet down the near wall, and to reach it I had to pass within arm's length of maybe a dozen of them. So I moved the way I move on a high tower in a rebuilding Winslow, deliberate, every shift of weight planned a beat before I made it, never putting a sudden load on any single point. I kept my eyes locked on the door I was walking toward, and let the standing bodies stay at the soft edge of my vision, because some animal part of me was certain that looking straight at one would wake it, a superstition with no basis in anything, which I obeyed completely and without shame. I passed close enough to one to smell the specific human being it had been aftershave, faint under the rot, close enough to see it had been a young man in a county polo shirt with a laminated badge still clipped to the placket, close enough to see that its eyes were open and fixed on the far speaker, and that there was nothing at all behind them. No person, no light, just a body running on a frequency. The count played. They held. I reached the junction room and slipped inside. The transfer switch was exactly where Ruth had promised it would be, a heavy industrial knife switch in a gray painted panel, its position labeled in faded, brittle tape that someone had typed 40 years ago. I had the sequence memorized cold, the way I memorize any work I'm about to do somewhere. I can't afford a mistake. Open the comms feed breaker first. Throw the transfer lever to the alternate position. Close the dormitory speaker circuit onto the comms feed. Confirm continuity on the test points. 30 seconds of work for a man with steady hands in good light. My hands were not steady, and the light was a single caged amber bulb. But my hands knew the work better than they knew the fear. And that, and only that, is why it got done. I opened the breaker, I gripped the transfer lever and threw it across. And in the half-second of dead time between the old feed dropping out and the new feed catching hold, the gap that every transfer switch has, the gap you can't engineer away, the count stopped. The far speaker went dead. The whole room went silent. And 38 heads, all at once, in the same perfect unison they'd shown on the screen, turned away from the dark end wall and toward the only sound left alive in the room, which was me and my breathing. And the click of the switch. People who've described the moment a thing decides to kill them always make it sound long, like time stretches and slows, and you have all the room in the world to think. It does not. It is the fastest thing that has ever happened to me. The new feed caught the count flooded back through the speaker. A half-second of silence, and then 4, 4, 9, 1, hold pouring out into the room again. And most of the heads turned back toward the far wall, dragged around by the leash like iron filings snapping back to a magnet. Most. But that half-second had been enough for the nearest ones, the dozen I'd walked past, to lock onto the sound and the heat and the movement of me. And for those the count was no longer enough to hold. 4 of them came. Silent, faster than anything wearing a human shape should move. Across the concrete with their hands already up and reaching. And I was standing in a junction room the size of a closet with a shotgun I could barely swing in the space. I'd like to tell you I fought my way out clean. I didn't. I got the junction room door swinging shut, and the first one hit it, and the steel caught its forearm in the gap, and I put the shotgun barrel into that gap and fired point blank. And the sound of a 12 gauge in a sealed concrete box is not a sound. It's a physical blow. It slammed my own ears shut and rang the whole room like the inside of a bell. And that sound is the thing that saved everyone up top and damned the three of us down below. Because sound is how they hunt. And I had just rung the loudest bell in the world. I forced the door shut on a severed arm and 3 live runners throwing themselves against the other side. Dropped the latch and ran for the steel blast door with the count still playing and the great mass of them still leashed, and turned back toward the far wall. Garrett hauled me through by the collar and threw the bolts home behind me. And on the other side of the steel, I could hear those 3 that had broken loose hitting the door over and over. No rhythm to it. No longer interested in the count at all, just hammering toward the meat that had made the noise. But the leash had held for the rest. That was the thing. That was the whole, terrible, partial victory of it. The transfer had worked. The dormitory speaker was running off the comms fuel cell now, the count playing strong and clean. And through the rolling gray security monitor, I could see the proof. 34 figures, standing, facing the wall, docile, held fast. 3 were loose and battering the steel in the junction room, awake and hunting and sealed away from us behind the door I'd just been dragged through. 1 was a dead arm jammed in a panel. The math had held, very nearly. I'd spent 3 of the 38 to buy weeks of leash for the other 34. And a real chance at life for the 2 living people in the comms room behind me. I told myself that was a win. On the better nights, I still tell myself that. Here is the cost the arithmetic didn't show me until I was halfway up the ladder. The cost I carried back into the daylight. When I'd fired the shotgun in that sealed box, the muzzle blast and the spray came back at me from a foot away. And I had a cut on my cheek, a small, clean cut I'd taken in the chapel on the way in. Ducking under the low stone doorframe, the kind of nothing cut I'd told a dying woman 2 days ago, you cannot tell from a bite once it scabs over. I hadn't thought about it once down in the bunker. I thought about it now, climbing toward the square of gray daylight with blood on my face that wasn't all my own, toward Eli and Cole and Priya, who would look at a man coming up out of the death hole with blood on his face, and remember, every one of them, the rule I'd written and made them swear to. Nobody comes inside with an open wound. No exceptions, because you cannot tell a cut from a bite. I came up into the cold stone of the chapel and out through the door into the cemetery. And the daylight was the same flat, gray afternoon. No warmth in it, the dead grass standing still in the windless air. My people were where Priya had moved them, back by the rusted iron gate. And when they saw me step out of the chapel with blood streaking down my cheek, every rifle in that graveyard came up and around to bear on me. Eli's voice, tight and young and badly scared under the control he was fighting to keep, told me to stop where I was. And I stopped. In the middle of a graveyard, 40 feet from the hole I dug for the woman who had started all of this, with a broken stone angel watching over both of us. And I understood, standing there with my own people's rifles trained on my chest, that the most dangerous thing in that cemetery was no longer underground. It was the rule I'd made with my own mouth. And the question on the faces of people I'd have died, for the question that has no good answer when there's blood on a man and infected behind every wall. Clean or bitten? And no way under heaven to know for certain until it was far too late to matter. I told them the truth, slowly, because the truth was all I had. And panic moves faster than truth if you let it. I told them about the bunker, the continuity site, the 41 who'd come down, and the 38 who'd turned. I told them about the leash, the count, the speaker, the transfer switch Ruth had pulled out of 30-year-old memory. I told them about the 3 that broke loose in the half-second gap and the shot, and the cut on my cheek that I'd taken on a stone doorframe and not on any tooth. I told it the way Garrett had stood at the bottom of the ladder, hands open and held out from my body where they could see them. No sudden moves, making myself easy to read. Eli kept his rifle up. Coles came down halfway and then stopped, caught between his sense and his fear. Priya, who had been down in that corridor with me and had seen with her own eyes that no biting happened, told them what she'd witnessed Garrett, the dying woman, the gray screen full of standing figures facing a speaker. And still Eli's rifle didn't drop, because Priya hadn't been in the dormitory with me. She hadn't seen the moment the count stopped and the heads turned. For 2 minutes I had been alone behind a steel door with the standing dead, and there was no living witness to whether I came back out the same man who went in. So I made the last decision, and it was the hardest of the three, because it was the one that cost me the thing I'd built my whole new life around. I crouched, slow, and set the shotgun down in the dead grass, and I stood and stepped away from it with my hands out. I told Eli to keep his rifle on me and walk me back up the ridge at a distance, and to put me in the equipment room alone, sealed, for 2 days. The full incubation window, 6 hours to 2 days. If I turned, they'd know, and the equipment room locked from the outside and had no other way out. And they could do what the rules said to do with anyone who turned. And none of it would be on their conscience, because I'd be the one who chose it. I wrote that rule. I would be the first person it was ever used on. That felt right to me in a way I couldn't put into words for them standing there and can barely put into words for you now. A man who builds a system ought to be willing to lie down on it himself and let it measure him. If the rule was good enough for everyone else's life, it was good enough for mine. They walked me back up the ridge at the end of a rifle, my own people, through the failing gray light of that long afternoon. Nobody saying much. The cemetery and its open hatch shrinking behind us. They put me in the equipment room, and they shut the heavy door, and they threw the outside latch, and through the small wire glass window, set into it I watched Ruth's face come up close on the other side. Ruth had run dispatch for 30 years and had buried more people than the rest of us put together. And she looked at me through that scratched glass with something that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite hope, just the steady weariness of a person who has learned to wait for bad news without flinching. 2 days, Marcus, she said through the door, her voice flattened by the steel. We'll know in 2 days. And then she said the thing that has stayed with me longer than the standing figures, longer than the breathing, longer even than the moment all those heads turned at once. She said, "The signal's still coming through up here, strong as ever, and it still says your name." I sat in that locked room for 2 days with a radio I wasn't allowed to touch, listening through the concrete wall to the count that Garrett's fuel cell was still pushing up the ridge. 4, 4, 9, 1. Hold the leash that was holding 34 bodies, still beneath a cemetery a 40-minute walk away. I sat, and I waited to find out whether I was clean, whether the cut on my cheek was a cut or the end of everything. And somewhere in the first night, in the dead air between 2 counts where the recording should have been silent, Dana's voice came through the wall again, just once, clear as if she were sitting on the cot beside me in the dark. She didn't read numbers. She said, "You did the right thing, Marcus, but the leash doesn't last forever, and someone has to go back down before the fuel cell dies, and they'll have to walk through the room again." Then the count resumed. 4, 4, 9, 1, hold, steady as a heartbeat. And I sat in the dark and understood with total certainty that Garrett's recording had never said my name and never could, that there were no names in the file, and that whatever was using the channel knew exactly what was coming, because it had done the same math I had. The leash was bought. Not 1, weeks, not forever. And at the end of those weeks, someone would have to walk back into that room full of the standing dead and feed the machine that kept them still, or let it stop and let them all wake at once. On the morning of the second day, the latch lifted and the door opened. I hadn't turned. The cut had been a cut, exactly as I'd said. Eli wouldn't quite meet my eyes when he swung the door back. He'd kept that rifle on me for 2 days in his mind, and he couldn't put it down all at once. Ruth gripped my shoulder hard enough to leave a bruise I was glad to have. Priya cried, quietly, with her hand over her mouth. Cole shook my hand once, firm, the way you confirm that a thing is real and solid and still standing. And I should have felt nothing but relief, and some part of me did. But I walked out of that locked room into the raw cold of the morning, and the first sound that reached me was the count, still coming through the relay speakers where Ruth had left a radio on. 4, 4, 9, 1, hold. And I knew. Standing there in the gray morning air, a free man, that the story wasn't over and never would be. We had inherited a leash and a fuel cell on a timer. The only place that could keep us alive through the winter sat on top of a chamber full of the standing dead. And the price of every safe night was a debt that came due in weeks. Payable in a slow walk through a silent room, past 34 heads that would only stay turned away as long as the music never, ever stopped. That's where I'll leave it, because that's where I still am. The signal still calls up the ridge. It still says my name on the nights. When the air goes dead between the counts. And I've stopped pretending it's a malfunction, because a malfunction doesn't tell you the truth about what you'll have to do. And it doesn't say you did the right thing in the voice of a woman you buried. We're planning the evacuation now. The 4 of us and Ruth and Garrett over the radio, hunched over the schematic on the back of that load sheet, trying to find a way to bring 34 leashed bodies up out of a sealed bunker without ever once letting the count stop. There may not be a way. We may simply be a group of people taking turns walking through a room to feed a machine until the day one of us doesn't come back out of it. If you've made it all the way down here in the dark with me, tell me where you're listening from, and tell me honestly when the fuel cell finally runs low and someone has to go back down and walk that 20 feet past the standing dead with the music holding by a thread. Should it be me, the man who built the rule and bought the leash and already knows the weight of that switch? Or do you send down someone whose hands haven't learned it yet? I've made my choice. I just don't know even now if it's the right one. And the count, 4, 4, 9, 1, hold, never stops long enough for me to be sure.